Tonight, I've got some allegedly true alone-in-the-dark scary stories to share with you. Holler at me in the comments if you're a fan of the video games. And be sure to send me your scary stories for narration at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear stories about monsters in the woods, sightings of the dogman, and scary rest stop stories. Also, I'll be tacking on the creepypasta I uploaded last night to the end of this video. Not too many folks watched it. YouTube doesn't do a great job of notifying people anymore, and Friday is always a bad day for uploads for my channel. So, enjoy. By the way, today's thumbnail illustration was provided by Jimmy Nice. Check the links in the description to get the artwork on a shirt, or to see more from this talented artist. Now, let's begin. Don't Turn Around, from T333R. My school consists of 3 old buildings, A, B, and C, which are connected by this bridge corridor, but let's just call it the bridge. There's also a mini zoo, yeah, I'm for real here, and a chapel. That's because one of the buildings used to be a monastery, before it became a hospital for soldiers in World War II. I promise you I don't study at Hogwarts, although my experience has everything to do with the supernatural. A few years ago, I stayed at school until late evening. Now, I don't enjoy being at school that much, but I was one of the volunteers who prepare some activities for newcomers at the beginning of the school year, so they can get to know their new classmates better. After an evening full of games, the kids were ready to go to sleep in the gym, and the teachers sent us to take care of the mess that was left behind. The school ground is quite large, so we had to split up, otherwise it would take us forever. I decided to clean up in the chapel. It was already dark outside, and I couldn't see a thing in those long hallways. As I walked, I turned the lights on in front of me, which meant that I would have to turn them off again on the way back and deal with the dark behind me. The thought of it made me quite nervous, but I didn't want to let my imagination freak me out even more. I was already uncomfortable by the complete silence surrounding me. I was used to seeing the space crowded by students, moving from classroom to classroom, discussing whatever was on their minds. When I made it to the chapel, I realized that I had no idea where the light switch was in there. I couldn't even use a flashlight, because I forgot my phone in a classroom, where us volunteers kept our bags. Luckily, the stuff that we left inside earlier was lying on the ground close to the door, so I just quickly collected it and left. I can't even remember what the stuff was anymore. I don't even remember which game took place in there. The occurrence that was awaiting me just overshadowed everything that had to do with that day. There I was, locking the door of the chapel, turning my back to the empty hallway, when suddenly, something started to feel really off. Once again, I blamed it on my imagination. Then, out of nowhere, the light above me just shut off. I looked around and saw that the more distant lights were still on. I stopped myself from thinking about all the horror movies I've seen, all those scenarios I could end up in. I simply wanted to get it over with and finally go home. I began to walk by the locked classrooms, trying to stay calm. After a few moments, I made it to the light switch, the one that would turn off the light in the part of the hallway I just went through. I had no other option but to press it. The light bulbs flickered, and in a split second, the space behind me went completely dark. I knew I shouldn't look over my shoulder. My brain would just make me see things, so I continued to walk. It went on like this with the next light switch too, except this time, my fearful thoughts became a reality. As soon as the light went out, I heard a loud sound. A sound that I was familiar with, yet it made my blood freeze. It was the sound of the door shutting hard, The next thing I knew, someone was running towards me. Before I even realized what was happening, my instincts kicked in and I started to sprint. The thing is, I still had to shut the lights down. Believe it or not, I started laughing like a maniac as I was hitting the switches I was passing by. Not once did I look back at whatever was trying to get me, leaving the darkness behind, because it would only slow me down. Finally, I got to the bridge that connects the two buildings. I no longer had to worry about turning off the lights, because they're always on in there. The moment I stepped in, everything went silent again. Whoever or whatever was chasing me was now gone, just like that. In disbelief, I walked to the classroom where the others were supposed to be. I tried to make some sense of the whole situation. Maybe one of them had been pranking me, but then I found out that everyone was already inside, eating their snacks and waiting for me. "Where were you for so long?" one of them asked. Was anyone else in the building B with me?" I ignored their question. "No. Why?" They answered, and I believed them. They all seemed confused, but also none of them looked as if they had just run up a bunch of stairs and through those darned long hallways. And how would they have gotten to the classroom sooner than me? The bridge is the only way from Building B, where I came from, to Building A, so it would be impossible for them to pass me without me seeing them. I've never found out what actually happened that evening, and I've never ever volunteered again, or stayed at school so late. But to this day, I still can't help but wonder, what would I have seen back then in the darkness if I had turned around? Creepy Stalker from Musta Been a Ghost. I was 16 years old, up at my dad's house in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. It was my 4th or 5th night up there. Those last 2 nights he would be working at night, leaving me home alone with his German Shepherd and my German Shepherd that I had brought up from my mom's house. Now it was a hot summer day and this house didn't have any AC, so from dusk till dawn we left the sliding glass door on the deck open to cool off the house. The house was pretty isolated, but in a safe area. My dad being a cop, we of course practiced the Second Amendment, so there were multiple firearms around the house. It was about 10:30 at night when I got one of the dogs on the couch with me, and I started to watch a movie. I think it was Silence of the Lambs, but anyway, the living room was downstairs along with my bedroom, so I couldn't see the sliding glass door, but as stated before, it was a safe area and had multiple firearms if needed. I never expected to have to even grab one, but nonetheless, I knew where they were and how to use them. About halfway through the movie, I was starting to nod off when I heard my dad's dog bark from the deck upstairs. I assumed he was just barking at an animal or something, so I thought nothing of it. After about 30 seconds, I heard my dad's dog start barking like mad. My dog got up and ran outside with the other one. At this point, I was freaked out quite a bit, so I grabbed the Glock 19 sitting on top of the mini fridge, as well as one of the flashlights my dad uses for work. I went outside to the deck with the dog still barking very aggressively at something outside the fence behind the house. As I turned the corner of the house to see what the dogs were barking at, they both stopped barking and started growling. They walked back toward the house with their tails between their legs and the fur on the back of their necks straight up. I could barely make this out as there were clouds covering the moonlight, but in the tree line about 15 yards from the fence, it was pitch black. I turned on the flashlight, and I pointed it to where the dogs were growling. The tree line lit up in bright white light, but I couldn't see anything at first. I continued to focus until I noticed a head peeking out from behind a tree. The head was completely bald, no eyebrows, just staring at me, no emotion on the face. The eyes were the darkest black I'd ever seen. Now, I was only 16, and I was by no means brave. I had no intention of confronting this person or thing at the time. Even with a firearm, something about this whole situation made me feel scared to my very core. It was like this wasn't a person at all, nor an animal. My mind was screaming at me to get inside at that very moment, and that's exactly what I did. I called the dogs, who were hesitant to turn their backs on the tree line, but I got them inside. I closed and locked the sliding glass door, grabbing a long rifle and calling my dad, who was on duty in the county. The dogs both lay at the back door, snarling and growling for the next 15 minutes, until they just stopped. 5 minutes after they stopped growling, I saw blue lights flashing and 2 squad cars coming down the driveway. 3 officers, including my dad, began to search the 30 acres of property, but came up with nothing. Yet they all said they felt uneasy, as if they were being watched. My dad's friend stayed by the house the rest of his shift, and fortunately, nothing else came of the situation. This was definitely the scariest experience of my life. Whatever was staring at me definitely wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. That was the first time in my life where my primal instincts overpowered any other feeling I had. Please be careful if you're in the Rocky Mountains, because meth heads and mountain lions aren't the only dangerous things out there. My brother-in-law saved me from something. From Guillermo. My parents have always been overprotective of my younger sister. They always asked me to go check on her every time she was in the country. On this occasion, I was told to go with her and her then boyfriend, but now husband, to keep an eye on them and spend a week at a cabin. This experience definitely made me appreciate her boyfriend even more. Anyway, my sister Fernanda was pretty annoyed, to say the least, that I was coming along for the week and just yelled at our parents while literally throwing bags in the car.
I'm 21 for God's sake, so I'm old enough not to be treated like this. The moment I can, you won't ever see me again.
She shouted before slamming the car door and starting the engine. She did a burnout on the driveway and just floored it. The whole way there, she just looked angry and didn't say a single word, not even to me. I had no idea at that time where we were going, but after a while it was clear that we were going to the mountains. We went up the mountain a bit and the surrounding woods looked amazing, so I just looked around for wildlife. I myself am a big animal lover, so I couldn't wait to get out of the car to start looking at the wildlife. As we drove up to the big cabin, we could see him standing there waving at us. No sooner as the car stood still, Fernanda ran out of the car and flew right into her lover's arms. Of course, they kissed, and it became a bit too uncomfortable for me, so I just started unpacking my things. A few minutes later, everything was unpacked, and it was already time for lunch. My sister is an amazing chef, so she just kicked us out of the cabin while she made some of her famous enchiladas. "So, G, you're once again keeping an eye on her, huh?" Lawrence, the boyfriend, asked. I didn't really know what to say, but then he just smiled and said, "No worries, man. Let's head on to the back and shoot a little, alright?" As we arrived in the back, there was a homemade shooting range. "My colleague has one heck of an awesome summer home, huh?" he said, opening up the shed next to the shooting range. There was a wide variety of guns and bows in the shed, along with some pretty expensive-looking tools. "So, what you think, G? Bows or guns?" To which I quickly answered, "I'm a gun guy, myself, since I suck with the bow and arrow." He smiled and replied, "Well, to each their own, but I call guns a coward's weapon, since you only need to pull a trigger and you need no skill at all." He was just teasing me. "Well, that may be, but I doubt you'd be able to beat me with a bow if I have this gun." I replied, "All right then, loser buys all the booze for the week. Deal?" We shook hands on it and went to the shooting range to see who had better aim. As he prepared his first arrow, I said, "It's about to be an expensive week for you." He smirked and fired. "You were saying, G?" Well then, he hit the bullseye perfectly in the middle. Lucky shot. I aimed the gun and shot slightly out of the middle. "That's about 2 points lower than me." He smiled, firing yet another arrow into the bullseye. That's how we started losing track of time, shooting, but in the end he did beat me pretty bad. After we ate some lunch, I got into the car, and as I rolled down the window, he said to me, "You know the brand?" I laughed. "Don't worry, just go. My sister's probably waiting for you." I bought all the stuff that my sister requested, as well as the booze that was agreed upon. On my way back, I saw all kinds of beautiful animals. Once I was back, I put everything in the kitchen, when my sister and Lawrence came walking down the stairs.
"I didn't hear you walk in,"
was all my sister said as she was fixing her hair. It was clear to me what they had been doing. "Whoa, babe, look at that buck." Lawrence pointed. I turned around and looked outside. Not even 10 feet from the window, we all saw this gorgeous buck, slowly walking around outside.
"That's just some wild animal. By the way, I'm sure there's lots more around here."
She didn't seem too impressed. She walked over to the couch and popped open a beer. Lawrence and I just stood there, looking at the buck, talking for a while. As the day went on, we had some fun, and my sister made dinner as well. We popped in a movie, but the movie turned out to be a dud. We were all pretty bored by it. Or at least I was. When I glanced over and noticed my sister was all curled up with Lawrence, I got up and thought I'd give them some alone time. After all, I wasn't really supposed to be here. I was only here because of my overprotective parents. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, then I let them know where I was going. "I'm gonna go catch a breath of fresh air, alright?" I opened the door and I popped the beer open, taking a big sip. I then heard some rustling in the bushes. Of course, I was curious about what animal I was about to see. Slowly, I made my way over to the bushes, when I heard something that I didn't expect.
"Help me, please."
I noticed some antlers from behind one of the trees in the bright moonlight. Then the whisper came again.
"Help me."
I walked cautiously into the woods. I could hear leaves crumbling under my feet. The antlers were becoming more clear, but then it looked as if the creature they belonged to was rising. I was still focused on what kind of animal it would be. I noticed the bony claw that was grabbing the tree, and it was then that I was starting to get scared.
"Please help me."
Another whisper broke the silence in the air. I was then met with glowing yellow eyes, slowly coming out from behind the tree. My heart pounded in my chest. The beer can dropped from my hand. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't. That's how terrified I was. Then, out of nowhere, I felt something fly by my hair and thud against the tree where the creature was standing.
"Guillermo!"
I heard my sister shouting loudly. It woke me from my stupor, and I ran back to the cabin. Lawrence closed the door behind me, and my sister hugged me, saying,
"Oh my God, are you okay?"
It talked. It seriously talked, was all Lawrence could say as he peeked through the window. "Looks like we scared it off, though," he managed to state. He put the bow he had in his hand on the kitchen counter. He had shot that arrow into the tree to save me. My sister ran over to him and kissed him.
"Thank God you're both okay. I'm glad that thing didn't get either of you."
There was some trembling in her voice, but Lawrence managed to calm her down. After about an hour, my sister and I decided to go to bed. The next day, we found Lawrence asleep on the couch. He clearly thought he needed to keep guard that night. And after what my mom told me after I described the creature, we're happy he did. I'm happy that we all made it down that mountain in one piece. Not alone after all. From Little Butterfly. My dad has always called me his little butterfly, ever since I can remember. My dad even made me a hidden room just for me in my room, which he and I spent a lot of time in when I was little. He owns a garage shop. He makes cars look amazing. We both love muscle cars, and especially the Dodge Charger RT from 1970. In fact, I have one now myself, just like my dad. In fact, this happened on the day I got that beautiful car, which would have been 6 years ago. My bike had been stolen. I called up my mom and asked her to come and get me. After half an hour, she arrived and I jumped into her car. We hadn't even set off when my mom just said, "Your dad has to work another shift, so he won't be home until late." I just sighed and answered, "So I can't go to the garage shop and start working on the Camaro then?" My mom shook her head, which made me feel even worse. During the drive, though, that changed when my mom told me, "So you'll be 16 in a few days. Your dad and I have been spending some time thinking about a good present for you." She smiled at me. Mom, what's this surprise gonna be?" She smiled even bigger, then said, "You'll see." We arrived at home, and as we opened up the house garage door, I saw a black Dodge Charger RT standing in the garage.
"Wait, you said Dad wasn't home."
I turned my head around to my mom and she was holding a key. "That's right, because this is your car." I lost it, jumping around and hugging my mom. I couldn't believe it. Okay, just wait till tomorrow so you can drive it first thing with your dad." I nodded. The day went on and my little half-sister, who's 4 years younger than me, just couldn't sit still. I was a little annoyed about it. My biological mom died giving birth to me due to complications, so that's why I have a half-sister, and I call her mom my mom. When we went to bed, I had a hard time sleeping. I was just so excited about taking my dad out in my own car. But of course, I eventually did doze off. I woke up, though, because my half-sister was screaming at the top of her lungs. I ran to her room and saw her lying on the ground, clearly in tons of pain. My mom then just burst through the door, picking her up and telling me, "We're going to the hospital right now." I then noticed that my little sister's arm was contorted in a very weird way. Her arm was broken, or worse.
"I'll stay home and tell Dad so he doesn't have to worry, okay?"
Mom just nodded. I opened the window in my room to let in some fresh air. It was a pretty warm night. After she was dressed, my mom and my little sister went to the hospital. I walked downstairs for a drink. I popped open the can and saw the front door still wasn't fixed. It had been broken for a while. I sighed looking at it, thinking, that thing's gonna drop right out of the opening if it ain't fixed within a few days. As I placed the can on the little coffee table near the kitchen, I heard a voice coming from the other side of the front door. "Hey, open up. It's Daddy." At first, it did sound like my dad, so I slowly walked over to the front door, replying, "You do have keys, you know, Dad."
Just open it.
When I heard that from the other side of the door, I knew it wasn't my dad. My dad never talked to me like that, and I noticed there was some distortion to his voice, almost a demonic tone. Then there was a bang on the door, which startled me, and I shouted, "Go away! You're not my dad." The banging came again, while whatever was on the other side of the door shouted, "Open the door. Open the door." I could even see the door beginning to crack. I ran upstairs to my own room. There was a sudden loud sound, and I knew the door had been busted down. And whatever it was that sounded like my dad but wasn't him was now inside the house. With my heart nearly trembling out of my chest, all I could think to do was go into my old hidden room. Come give Daddy a hug. I slammed the door to my little hidden room and locked it, and I heard running up the stairs, followed by a sort of growl. I grabbed my phone and texted my dad. "Please come home, there's something in here and I'm scared." No sooner as I'd sent that message, I heard, "Daddy only wants a hug." Then I heard things being thrown around. The phone vibrated in my hand, and I saw my dad had sent a message. "On my way, Butterfly, just hang on." "Where are you?" I heard it from the other side of the door. I placed my hands over my mouth and started to cry, which caused the phone to fall on the floor. Luckily, it didn't seem to hear the falling of my phone through the sounds of everything in my room being tossed. The sounds of throwing stopped, but then my phone vibrated, making a loud sound which the creature clearly noticed. "There you are." Its voice came from right on the other side of the door. I started sobbing as I grabbed my phone and read the message from my dad. "I called the police. They're on their way, so hang on." I messaged him back saying, "Daddy, please, it's on the other side of the door. Please come fast. I'm scared." Then the banging on the door started. The phone vibrated. "I'm a few blocks away, Butterfly, be brave." The creature growled. It banged on the door, which was beginning to crack. Fear had completely taken me. The only thought that went through my mind was how my dad was literally going to be seconds late to save me. He would find me lifeless in my room if I was still there. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of his Charger RT, and I lost my mind, shouting for him. "Daddy, I'm here!" I saw a piece of the door break off. I saw pale skin, and I swear there was a glowing yellow eye on the other side. My heart almost stopped at the sight of it. My dad called out, "Butterfly, where are you?" The thing growled. I heard footsteps running on the stairs and a rustling in my room. Police sirens followed after. The next thing I saw through the hole in my door was my dad standing in my room. I burst out and hugged him, crying my eyes out. Together, we went downstairs, and I told everything I'd experienced to the police. It was clear they had a hard time believing me. My mom and sister arrived later when the police had left. My mom asked, "What on earth happened here?" My dad told her everything. I slept in their bed for a few weeks, as I was too scared to sleep alone. Luckily, the door in my room and front door were quickly replaced the following day. That thing never returned, which I'm thankful for. And now that I live on my own, I'll keep my doors locked and maintained, and I hope nothing that frightening ever happens again. The following story is a fictional story I wrote. I uploaded it yesterday in its own video, but not a lot of people saw it, and many people complained of YouTube not sending out notifications. So here it is. I hope you all enjoy it. Someone in my family isn't human, by Darkness Prevails. Someone in my family is not human, and they haven't been since our trip to the family cabin. The four of us had always stayed at the cabin every year in the fall. We spent the initial cooling of autumn by the warmth of a cabin fire, as if to prepare ourselves for an even harsher winter. My father, mother, little brother Chris, and I enjoyed this tradition, and that moment every year when we would first see a leaf change color and fall to the ground, our excitement grew. Our yearly retreat meant sledding, snowball fights, hot chocolate, and that nostalgic scent of pine wood that made up the walls of the structure. We would spend a week there in those snowy mountains, close, bonding, happy. Dad would tell ghost stories and cliched urban legends every evening, and Mom would cook a feast of a country breakfast in the mornings. It was a pine-scented, bacon-flavored heaven. Until that particular nightfall fell, and a horrid noise erupted from the mountains around us. You could call it a howl, but it was unlike any howl I'd ever heard. Nature documentaries, horror films, real life. There was no equivalent to this sound. It seemed to reverberate forever off the slopes. It was loud enough to have our family in fear of an avalanche. But it wasn't a tempest sheet of ice and snow that shook us to our core. There was no avalanche. Rather, the sound of this howl seemed to affect my younger brother. After some time, I noticed he hadn't blinked for several minutes. His eyes watered, tears dripping down his cheeks, and yet he denied his body the satisfaction of blinking. I tried to get his attention, but the moment I spoke his name, he burst from his position on the rug, running out the door. My mother called after him. My father pursued, and in a panic, I found myself on my father's heels. Yet the old man was too fast for me. Moments after we entered the tree line running after my little brother, I'd lost sight of them both. The mess of footprints, animal prints, and various other disturbances in the snow left me with no idea where either of them had gone. My head shot back and forth in every direction, desperate for a clue. Knowing I couldn't just sit there, I ran forward, hoping that one of these sets of tracks would lead me to a familiar face. My cheeks and eyelids burned from the cold and wind that brushed past them. The snow came down harder, causing my teary-eyed vision to become even more dodgy. And then it happened. I hadn't expected to break through a tree line. I hadn't expected to fall down a sharp slope. After that, hitting my head upon a low-hanging branch and blacking out was no surprise at all. When I came to, it was still dark, still night. I looked around and quickly spotted the tree I had assaulted with my head. But now it was a couple of dozen yards away. Looking around me, I found myself further up the slope than when I'd blacked out, with a trail leading from the tree to where I lay now. As if I'd been dragged. Assuming it was my father who, for one odd reason or another, could not accomplish the task of carrying me back to the cabin, I called out his name. I didn't care for any avalanches. I belted my voice across those mountains and prayed my father would find me. There was a response, but it wasn't my father. There was a chilling scream coming from further up. It sounded like my mother. I picked myself up out of the much thicker snow. I lurched up the slope. I managed to find my way back, having memorized the direction of the scream. Sure enough, it had come from our cabin. Emerging from the tree line, I saw the cabin door wide open. It must have been that way for some time, as a thick layer of snow had found purchase on the hardwood floor inside. I took off in a haphazard sprint, meandering my way to the door through the snow. When I set foot on the wood surface, it felt as if I was on another planet. Stable footing was something I didn't know I could miss. "Mom?" I called out as I walked through the doorway. I pushed as much of the snow back outside as I could, and then I shut the door. I glanced around the room. The ember within the fireplace was dwindling, and my mother was nowhere to be seen. She had been sitting at the chair across the room from the fireplace, enjoying a toasty mug of dark roast coffee. With a sniff, I could very well still smell her distinct coffee, even in spite of my runny and stuffy nose. My boots slid, nearly causing me to fall, as I ran to the kitchen. Before I passed through the archway, a figure taller than myself emerged from around the corner. "Mom?" I whimpered. The fire crackled, and thin, dancing strips of light bounced from the form's face. It looked like my mother, but she was frowning and seemed to be staring past me. "Gloria, Chris is hurt." That voice was my father's. I turned on my heel to see him doggedly carrying my little brother in his arms. The small boy's face was tinged red and his breathing shallow. Struggling with what to say or do, I heard my mother finally speak.
"Everyone in the car," she demanded.
I obeyed without question or hesitation. The four of us piled into that 1999 Range Rover and hauled tail to the nearest hospital or doctor that could see us. To this day, Chris has a small scar on his cheek where he'd gotten frostbite. He doesn't seem to remember a bit of that night. Doesn't even recall the mint chocolate cocoa we'd shared by the fire before he sprinted off into that near blizzard. Dad said he'd searched for Chris for several hours. He'd found my brother under the snow, and what bothers me was the way Dad said it appeared Chris had been buried, not simply covered by falling snow. Even now, my dad is adamant that there were dozens of other prints around the mound in which Chris had been buried. As for me, when I woke up from blacking out after hitting that tree branch, I'd apparently awakened near morning, though it was still quite dark out. The doctor said I was quite lucky that I didn't get frostbite too, though I did get a nasty concussion. But that didn't weigh on my mind. Instead, I couldn't keep myself from wondering what had dragged me up the slope. Because Dad said he never saw me. He even apologized, saying that he didn't know I took off after him once Chris left the cabin. And regarding my mother, she always behaved strangely when talking about the event. She says when the three of us ran out of the cabin, she closed the door and had an emergency number dialed on her phone ready to call for help at a moment's notice as she watched out the window. But that just doesn't match up. And the way she looked at me when I came back to the cabin. Well, as the months went on after returning home, things slowly felt normal again. We all seemed to forget the panic of that night, realigning ourselves with our daily routines and habits. Before long, I stopped noticing Chris's scar. I stopped pestering my mother about her recollection of events. I stopped harassing my father about exactly what he saw out there. It's funny how going back to school, spending the night at friends' houses, and enjoying the newest video games can make it seem as if a traumatic event never happened. Or maybe I simply didn't want to think about it anymore. A few months after the cabin excursion, I awoke one night to my eyes watering and my nose wrinkled. There hung a sour smell in the air, working thoughts of spoiled milk or sun-worn cheese in my mind. It was the first time in my life a smell had been vile enough to stir me from slumber. I gagged when I tried to yawn. Throwing the sheets off of me, I groggily crept from my bed in search of the smell. One messy plop underfoot later, I realized the source of the smell lay right at the foot of my bed, right where I had just stepped. Lifting my foot and wincing at the wretched sensation of unknown sludge and mucus stuck to my heel, I stared down at the rug. A pile the color of pitch-dark blue, with tinges of peachy flesh-tinted clots, sat as a splatter on the floor. There was so much of it. Horrified, I screamed, awaking my brother who shared the room with me and causing my father to come running down the hallway. "What's the matter?" he asked hurriedly after throwing open the door. I don't know what this stuff is, and it's everywhere." I tried to maintain composure in my explanation. My dad approached where I was standing. He squinted his eyes and flinched when the smell really hit him. What did you do?" he demanded to know, still staring at the refuse while pinching his nose. I didn't do anything. How could I even make something..." I pointed at the revolting mess. "Like this?" My father raised an eyebrow, looking to me then back at the sludge-like mass. He walked over and knelt down, examining the substance. I thought he was going to touch it for a second, but then I saw him grimace. A few extended moments later, he said, Just clean it up, the both of you." I rolled my eyes, still ready to vomit or scream, depending on what the sludge decided to do if I touched it. Chris went straight for the bottle of Febreze we kept in the bathroom. A minute after Dad had left the room, he came back. "Hey, did your mother pass by here?" I shook my head. His brow furrowed. I listened to him walk down the hallway toward the living room, calling her name, but not getting a response. After cleaning up the mess, Chris and I helped look for her, but she was nowhere in or around the house. She wasn't answering her phone either. After hours of searching, we all slept in Dad's bed, hoping she would return soon. In the morning, I woke up next to Dad, who seemed to be unblinkingly staring at the opposite end of the bed. Slowly, I looked over past Chris's still sleeping form, and there was my mother, smiling at us as if she had just awakened from a peaceful night's rest. "Good morning," she bid us. My father woke Chris and forced the two of us out of their room. We then heard our parents arguing for the next 10 minutes, after which my mother stormed out of their room and sat patiently at the kitchen table while her coffee brewed from our Keurig. The smell of dark roast coffee hung in the air. I cringed at it, reminded of the cabin. That was all it took before I looked at her like I looked at her then, with suspicion and fear. Once the sound of coffee spurting from the dispenser ceased, Mom walked over, then returned with her steaming beverage. She stared off into the distance, which wasn't more than a tall kitchen window with white blinds. That was the face of my mother, deeply concerned. It was then I happened to find focus on her fingernails. There was something there to see, and my eyes wouldn't pry away from them, even though I didn't understand why for a few seconds. Then, mouth agape, I knew. The same pitch-dark blue substance, it was stuck underneath each one of her fingernails. There were even traces of the flesh-colored clots. Feeling a need to ascertain what I'd noticed, I ran up to her and forced my arms around her. A hug that I wanted to recoil from, but I was close enough then to smell her hand. Coffee grounds, earth, curdled milk, and putrid cheese.
Oh, sweetie, Mom and Dad are gonna be okay.
She rubbed my forearm, those dirty nails sliding across my skin.
It's just, I'm going through a hard time right now, okay?
I released my hold on her and stepped back. She was crying. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at me. No, through me, once again. I hated it. Something about the way she now looked at me I despised. It made me nauseous and angry all at once. My mother, ever since that night at the cabin, hadn't once looked at me normally. Hadn't once treated me as she had used to. That was the beginning of the changing of my mind. This person drinking my mother's coffee, wearing my mother's bathrobe, and sitting at my mother's chair, it wasn't my mother at all. From then on, I kept a safe distance from her, but I always made sure I was close enough to observe her. Sometimes I would watch her when she didn't know I was there. I was invigorated to rediscover her daily routine. Was it the same? If she looked at her own son so differently anymore, then surely the small, more mundane aspects of her life had changed in kind. I watched her do the laundry through cracked door. I stared at her when she left for her morning runs. I pretended not to notice when she came back, glancing a little bit more than she knew. Yet it all seemed the same. Aside from the occasional discrepancies in her behavior, like the night with the mess in my room, my mother acted like she used to. Then I decided to test her in a different way. When she'd leave on her own, I'd ask to go with her. When she'd go for runs, I'd ask to join her. When she was bored and looking at her phone, I requested that she play a board game with me. Any decent parent would see this as a child longing for more attention from their parent. But it soon became clear to me that my mother didn't see it this way. She seemed hesitant when I asked to tag along, and when she would eventually give in, Mom would always have nothing to say or talk about. It was clear she didn't want me around her. This broke my heart even more. My mother and I had always been so close. She used to read the Boxcar Children book series to me in bed. She always made sure I got dibs on the mixing bowl when she was making brownies or cookies. And when my first girlfriend broke up with me, my mother held me and cried with me. That had been my mother. Whoever or whatever this person was, it was no longer her. One night, I awoke in a cold sweat. Something felt wrong, I felt hot and cold, achy yet numb, and I had a bad taste in my mouth. I sat up in my bed and wiped my tired eyes. When I opened them again, I nearly screamed. A tall, dark figure stood at the edge of my bed. Feminine, familiar, my mother. She was holding something in her right hand, but it was too dark for me to be sure of what it was. "Mom?" I called to her in an exhausted voice. She did not voice a reply. Instead, she shook her head. Seconds later, I could see a glimmer in her eyes. Tears? She stepped forward, beginning to approach my side of the bed, her right hand rising into the air with that unknown object grasped tightly. I tried to crawl away, but my back hit only wall. Then she began to swing. Instinctively, I closed my eyes and covered my face with my hands, palm out. In that moment, I can't be sure if I felt anything at all, but I do know my heart pounded with denial. "Honey, what are you?" My father entered the room and turned on the light. Revealed was my mother, standing over me, a knife in her hand. There was blood on my blankets, blood on my hands, and that repugnant odor had once again returned. I looked her right in the eyes. There seemed to be nothing human left in them. My father leapt and stole the knife from her grasp, shouting expletives. When the knife fell, hitting the hardwood floor with a metallic clang, she took off from my room. I heard her exit the house. My dad began to dial 911, but I grabbed him by the arm. "Please don't. Not Mama," I pleaded. He looked at me. Then he turned toward my brother, who was cowering wide awake in the corner. My father, gritting his teeth, locked his phone. He took the two of us to his room and began to explain that our mother just wasn't well. She needed help, he said, but even he didn't seem to understand what was wrong with her or why. My heart ached. I was breathless the remainder of the night. How could she have done this? Even if my paranoid thoughts about her were now solidified, I still could not believe it. My own mother had tried to kill me. Dad called my grandma on Mom's side, letting her know which direction she took off in and that it might be best to find her sooner rather than later. I didn't sleep that night, opting to wander the halls, looking out the windows of our quiet home and afraid I'd see my own mother through them. I went to the front door, making sure it was locked. Then I checked the back. While the back door was closed, I noticed it was unlocked. As I reached for the bolt, I paused. There was a dark red stain on the floor leading underneath the door. Swallowing hard, I opened the back door and I peered outside. Thankfully, my mother wasn't there, but something else was, something that smelled of rot and soil. Looking down, my eyes saw it lying on the mat, an amputated, dirt-covered human leg. I wanted to vomit. I cried into my hands that my father had quickly bandaged. Though I didn't know who my mother was anymore, I took the leg and I hid it in a hole in the backyard. I still loved my mother, and I didn't want to see her in trouble. I went back to bed, and I tried to forget the entire night. For weeks, we didn't hear from my mom, until Dad finally got a call from Grandma stating that she was okay and being looked closely after at their place. My dad was quick to caution them, reminding them that having attacked her own son, there was no telling what she might do. Soon after, my mom began calling us herself. At first, Dad wouldn't even pick up the phone, but missing her, it didn't take long for him to relent. She begged him to come over to her parents' house so they could talk this through. He refused a dozen times before finally agreeing to see her. I couldn't blame the man. He loved my mom and had always been crazy about her. When the day came that he would talk with her, he pulled me aside and asked me to watch Chris here at the house. I complied with a nod, but what he didn't know was that I'd already told Chris that I'd be going with him. When he wasn't looking, I hid myself in the back of the vehicle just as he was about to leave. Half an hour later, the incessant bumps in the road I felt told me we were pulling into a gravel driveway. We were at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Dad exited the car and closed the door. I heard him speaking with my grandparents outside before they let him in. When I was sure no one remained outside, I crept from the back of the vehicle and made my way to the side of the house. I'd spent the night here many times before. I knew they had only 2 bedrooms, one a master bedroom and the other a guest room. If my mother needed a place of privacy to talk with my dad, it would certainly be in the guest room she'd be staying in. Staying close to the wall, I rounded the house. I crouched below the guest bedroom window, and I placed my ear to the wall. The house was old. That was to my advantage. I could hear nearly perfectly through the wooden planks.
I didn't attack our son.
My mother sounded exasperated.
I saw you in the kid's room holding a knife.
My dad shouted back.
Did you see him?
My son, bloodied from his own mother trying to cut him up? Of course I did.
Henry, I didn't touch him with that knife. That blood wasn't his. Did you not check him for cuts?
Gloria, there was so much blood. I bandaged him up as quickly as I could and prayed he wouldn't need a doctor. A doctor would need answers, and the kids begged me not to call the authorities on you. I couldn't risk it.
No, Henry. There were no cuts on him. Have you not seen how strangely he's been acting?
What? Are you trying to blame him for this?
He's always watching, always listening. He's been following me everywhere I go, and then I saw that leg at the back door and...
Leg? What?
That night, I found a severed human leg at the back door. Didn't you hear the news the next day? About the missing kid in our neighborhood?
No,
Henry, our son did that.
I listened unblinkingly, staring down at my bandaged hands. I began to unwrap them. Layer by layer, I could see my skin. Dried blood. No cuts. No bruises, no slices, nothing. The blood wasn't mine. My hands were perfectly clean, unscarred. My mother continued.
Look, I don't want to say it outright. Not yet. So I'll just start where it began. You remember what happened at the cabin, don't you? The weird howl in the mountains, little Chris running out the door in the snow. Well, Ben chased after you. Ben kept asking my account of what happened that night, but I always told him a lie. I didn't want him to know what I knew. You see, I chased after Ben. I was afraid one of you would get lost out there, and I had to make sure you would all be okay. I followed Ben, but he managed to stumble down a slope. When I saw him hit that tree, I was horrified, and I started to rush towards him, but then I saw something. I don't know what it was, but it crawled through the snow on all fours, and its limbs were so thin. It couldn't have been human. It grabbed Ben while he was unconscious and began to drag him up the mountain. I shouted at the thing. I couldn't let it take my son. But it turned its eyes on me and began to bound through the snow towards me. I ran back to the cabin. I figured there'd be something there I could defend myself with. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find and hid around the corner. The next thing I knew, the door slammed open. I didn't hear anything after that, save for another howl. Hours must have passed before I heard that door shut. I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen, and I rounded the corner. I saw Ben in front of me. I hid the knife behind me. I didn't want to scare him. I wanted to grab him and thank the heavens he was okay, but I stood there, frozen. Henry, Ben's eyes, they were solid black, and he was covered in this thick, dark substance. I couldn't bear to look right at him, but I looked long enough to see the black fade from his eyes and the substance absorb into his skin.
Gloria, this is too much for me. You're lying. What happened to you?
Nothing, Henry, but something happened to Ben. I left him out there. I didn't go back for him. That thing got him. That boy we brought home. That boy isn't ours. Think about it, Henry. He didn't have any damage from the cold like Chris did. The doctor said he had a concussion, but there was no sign of one at home. And that night when you three found that sludge in his room, I wasn't there that night because I'd been trying to dispose of the other half of it.
What?
Ben isn't human. That stuff, it comes from him. He changes. He follows a certain smell. I've seen the way he looks at us, the way he smells people and stares at them. When I watched him change again, I stayed up waiting for him to come home. Well, last time he came home with that human leg in his mouth. That's why I had a knife, Henry. Please, you have to believe me.
I hadn't realized that I'd slumped over onto the ground. I was still staring at my hands. She had to be lying, right? I thought to myself. I'm still me. I'm the same me that I remember. I tried to reason with everything she had confessed, but everything was perfectly explained by what she said. The muck under her nails, the sludge at the foot of my bed, the way she suddenly started looking at me and treating me differently. And most of all, the blood on my hands that didn't come from me. My mother and father have since separated. My dad kept both of us, and my mother now lives with her parents. She calls almost every day, begging my dad to keep Chris safe from me. I can hear her over the phone with how loud she begs, but my father doesn't completely believe her. Or he does, and he's simply in denial. I've seen how he looks at me when he tells Chris and me goodnight. I've seen how he lingers at the door, staring right at me for a moment before leaving the door open and going to his own room down the hallway. I've seen how he cleans up my messes in the middle of the night by the bed, pretending it's normal, like it's the mess of some puppy that needs to be housebroken. And now every night, when I close my eyes to sleep, I look at my brother. He's still so young enough to sleep peacefully. At most, he's confused about everything that's happened, but he trusts us all as he always had. But I don't trust myself, because one day I'm afraid that the other me I change into will see how easy of a meal Chris might be.